Part 5 of the Corps Commander training videos will cover movement and everything associated with movement. We will initially be covering modes, that is, the modes an element may adopt in the game. All elements on the playing area must adopt one of three voluntary modes, which are travel, concentrated, or dispersed. In addition to the voluntary modes, there is a special disrupted mode, which represents troops routing. Travel mode is the mode used for fast strategic movement. The element is unable to take advantage of terrain and are therefore extremely vulnerable to enemy fire. The element is deployed in column and can therefore bring little of its strength to bear against the enemy to its front. The only exception are reconnaissance elements, which do not take any of the penalties for being in travel mode if fired upon. Concentrated mode is considered the default mode in most cases. Concentrated mode concentrates the element into its optimum attacking formation. This concentration means that the element is still reasonably vulnerable to enemy fire, but it is also able to move quite quickly through most terrain. Some elements cannot adopt concentrated mode. These are normally tank destroyer elements. This has an issue with movement, as concentrated mode provides the optimum movement allowance without adopting travel mode. Players can allow these elements to adopt concentrated mode for movement purposes only. Dispersed mode disperses the element, or the troops or vehicles in the element, so they may take the best advantage of available cover. It also includes the routine digging in and construction of minor strong points, and the taking up of covered positions for vehicles. The use of terrain to minimise casualties and the loss of cohesion due to dispersal usually results in a loss of offensive effectiveness. A further effect of this dispersal is a great reduction in speed during the more cautious use of available cover. This mode is the usual formation used in defence. A disrupted element is considered to be in dispersal mode. An element in concentrated or travel mode which is forced to disrupt automatically disperses. Disruption means that all cohesion has been lost and the element is incapable of executing effective fire or voluntary movement. Disruption is forced as a result of a failed morale test, close assault, or air strike. Changing from travel mode to concentrated mode, or vice versa, costs an element half its movement allowance. Changing from dispersal mode to concentrated mode, or vice versa, costs an element half its movement allowance. Changing from travel mode to dispersal mode, or vice versa, costs an element its entire movement allowance, unless if concentrated is not allowed, in which case it costs an element half its movement allowance. Elements in travel mode have their movement allowance doubled. This is the main benefit of travel mode, and coupled with moving on a road allows these elements to move very rapidly. Elements in travel mode, which are a target of fire combat, have a +2 modifier applied to them. In addition, if the element is armour, which is fired at the flank or rear, there is a 1+1 modifier. Elements in travel mode are very vulnerable to fire combat. Elements in travel mode, which are conducting fire combat, have a maximum strength of 1 strength point. Elements in travel mode, which are close assaulted, have a strength of 1 strength point. Elements in travel mode cannot conduct close assault. These last two rules are optional, but are highly recommended. Concentrated mode is the standard mode for movement and fire combat, so there is no special effects when concentrated. Dispersed elements, which are fired at, gain a -1 to -4 modifier for being dispersed in different terrain types or fortifications. This is the main advantage of being dispersed. Dispersed elements conducting fire combat suffer a -2 penalty for being dispersed, unless concentrated mode is prohibited, in which case there is no penalty. Dispersed elements' movement allowance is halved, which is the main disadvantage of being dispersed. We'll now be actually covering the movement and how to conduct movement in Corps Commander. All elements are given a mobility rating or value, which is used to determine their movement allowance. An element's final movement allowance is based on their basic movement allowance, which is calculated by cross-referencing their mobility rating with the terrain they are travelling across. In this slide, if we cross-reference standard mobility with clear terrain, we arrive at a basic movement allowance of 25 centimetres. All elements are for elements in concentrated mode unless it's in rounded brackets, in which case concentrated mode is prohibited and the values are for dispersed mode. In this slide, if we cross-reference standard mobility with forest, we arrive at a basic movement allowance of 5 centimetres. The element is in dispersed mode in this case. Some mobility types and terrain combinations are prohibited, thus an element with truck mobility cannot move through forest in any mode. The mode an element is adopting will affect its final movement allowance. If an element is in travel mode, its basic movement allowance is doubled, and if in dispersed mode, it's halved. The only exception is if elements are in steppe or plains, in which case the basic movement allowance is 2/3 of the value shown in the basic movement allowance table if dispersed. If an element is in desert, dispersed mode has no effect on its basic movement allowance. Some activities cause an element to expend a percentage of its movement allowance with no actual movement occurring. Changing mode is an example of this, when a mode change can expend either half or an element's entire movement allowance, depending on which mode you're moving from to. As with a mode change, limbering or mounting can expend a percentage of an element's basic movement allowance. Unlimbering or dismounting can be conducted at no cost. There are a number of special movement effects as well. A self-propelled artillery element conducting a shoot and scoot, which is a combined fire and movement, expends 3/4 of its basic movement allowance doing so. This leaves it with 1/4 of its basic movement allowance to actually move. Crossing an engineer-built bridge, linear obstacle, or a large stream expends half an element's movement allowance doing so. An element which is conducting a close assault must expend half its movement allowance in doing so, as does any element conducting close support. If an element is in travel mode, it cannot cross a stream. If an element is in concentrated or travel mode, it cannot enter or move through forest, jungle, broken or marsh. If an element is in dispersed mode, it cannot take advantage of roads or tracks. Engineers may ferry elements across rivers, and some vehicles have amphibious capabilities. These take a whole movement phase to cross a river up to 10 centimetres wide. For each additional 5 centimetres or part thereof, add a quarter of a move. To use their amphibious capabilities, the vehicles must be dispersed. When an element moves across more than one type of terrain, determine the percentage of an element's movement allowance is expending when it crosses a terrain and what remains. Thus, an element which expends half a move crossing clear terrain has half a move remaining to cross other terrains, such as open woods. We will now cover limbering, mounting, unlimbering and dismounting and all the effects related, particularly to mounted or dismounted infantry. Number of weapons need to be towed in order to move long distances, or in some cases, any distance. This can include anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft guns, infantry guns, recoilless guns, howitzers, guns or rocket launchers. These types of weapons need to limber in order to move and unlimber in order to conduct fire combat. Infantry can be transported by vehicles. While infantry can move on foot, for long distances they would often be mounted in a vehicle. Infantry need to mount a vehicle in order to be moved by it and need to dismount in order to fight and move on foot. There are a number of different vehicles which can transport infantry. A lorry can transport infantry, but infantry cannot fight from, in and around a lorry. A lorry is large, difficult to dismount from and mount on, and is a large target for the enemy. As a result, it is used to move infantry close to the combat area where they dismount. A combat transport is a vehicle which allows infantry to fight from, in and around it. The vehicle is smaller, easier to dismount or mount from, and may be armed. In some cases, the combat transport could be armoured as well, although some armoured combat transports, such as mechanised infantry combat vehicles, restrict the ability of infantry to fight while mounted. Finally, infantry can be transported on top of vehicles such as tanks. The infantry are very vulnerable to enemy fire, but gain the movement benefit of being on a vehicle. Infantry mounted in a lorry cannot fight while mounted. The lorry's observation and combat capability is used. As a lorry is large and would be unarmed, this would make it a vulnerable target. When infantry dismount from a lorry, the lorry is removed and replaced with the infantry element. Infantry mounted in soft combat transports can fight while mounted. the soft combat transport observation category is used. The combined combat capability of the soft combat transport and infantry is used. The soft combat transport is a vulnerable target, but would be highly mobile. Some soft combat transports are armed, such as a jeep with a machine gun. These would be a very effective combat troop, but would be highly vulnerable to enemy fire. When infantry dismount, the soft combat transport is removed and replaced with the infantry element. Infantry mounted in a armoured combat transport can fight while mounted. The armoured combat transport observation category is used. The combined combat capability of the armoured combat transport and infantry is used. The armoured combat transport is large, but it's also armoured. Examples of an armoured combat transport is a half-track or armoured personnel carrier. In most cases, these combat transports are armed, so the combination would be very effective. When infantry dismount, the armoured combat transport is removed and replaced with the infantry element. A special type of armoured combat transport is the mechanised infantry combat vehicle. These vehicles can engage in combat with or without its mounted infantry. Infantry mounted in a mechanised infantry combat vehicle can fight while mounted, although this is restricted. A mechanised infantry combat vehicle is heavily armed and totally enclosed in armour, only allowing their mounted infantry to fight from gun slots. The mechanised infantry combat vehicle observation category is used. The combat capability of the mechanised infantry combat vehicle with a modifier for the infantry, if mounted, is used. When infantry dismount, the infantry element is placed next to the mechanised infantry combat vehicle, and both now move and fight separately. Infantry mounted on top of a tank can fight while mounted. The tank's observation category is used. The combined combat capability of the tank and infantry is used. The tank is large and its armour does not protect its mounted infantry, thus the infantry are vulnerable. This is commonly used by the Russians and to a lesser extent the Germans during World War II. When infantry dismount, the infantry element is placed next to the tank and both move and fight separately. We will now look into more detail the ability to conduct direct fire and movement at the same time, which is called half fire. Any element which did not conduct fire combat during the previous fire phase may combine movement and fire combat during the phasing movement phase. This is called half fire because half an element's movement allowance is used to move and half to conduct direct fire. The direct fire must be first conducted and then the element can move a half move. Half fire is executed element by element before each of the elements are moved. It is normally used if the target element was not visible in the fire phase, but is visible now because it conducted direct fire during the previous direct fire phase. When conducting half fire, the firer applies a negative modifier. If the gun is stabilised, that is -1. If it is not stabilised, this is -2. During the fire phase, the Russian T-72 battalion did not fire because it could not see the M1. The M1 did fire during the fire phase, so is now visible in the Russian phasing movement phase at 24 centimetres distance. During the Russian first movement phase, the T-72 battalion conducts half fire against the M1. The T-72 battalion conducts direct fire at 14.5 centimetres. The fire effectiveness at an armoured target is 16. The M1 defensive effectiveness is 14. The results is a base fire column of 7. The M1 is dispersed in open wood, which results in a -1 modifier. The M1 is a very small target, which results in a -2 modifier. The T-72 battalion is conducting half fire and is stabilised, which results in a further -1 modifier. The aggregate modifier is -4, resulting in the final fire column of 3. Cross-reference this fire column with 6 strength points, and this results in a fire value of 5. The Russians spin a 3, 4 and 9. This results in no effect, dispersed and 1 hit, which has the effect of inflicting 1 loss. The T-72 battalion moves almost half its movement towards the M1. A half move is 15 centimetres. This would allow the M1 to conduct opportunity fire if it moved the full 15 centimetres. It moved 14.5 centimetres, so this did not occur. The non-phasing player can conduct opportunity fire against any enemy element which moves within its opportunity fire range and triggers opportunity fire. Any element which changes its mode or debusses, which means dismounts, within the opportunity fire range of an enemy element can trigger opportunity fire. The only exception is infantry mounted in an armoured combat transport, which can debus without triggering opportunity fire in some cases. Any element which conducts a total of 6 centimetres of movement within opportunity fire range can trigger opportunity fire. Any element which conducts at least 15 centimetres of total movement within a phasing movement phase and which ends its movement within the opportunity fire range of an enemy can trigger opportunity fire. An element may make an opportunity fire attack against a maximum of 2 elements for each different cause triggered for all direct fire weapons except anti-tank guided weapons, which may only fire once for each cause. Close assault is an exception. An element can always conduct opportunity fire against an element conducting close assault against it. This means an element could conduct opportunity fire many times in a given non-phasing movement phase. Twice for the 6 centimetre movement trigger, twice for the 15 centimetre movement trigger, twice for the mode or mounting change trigger, and twice against 2 elements conducting bridge demolition. This is very unlikely, but is possible. We will now explore close assault, close support, and close combat. A close assault initiates close combat. The objective is to move a friendly element into the same space an enemy element occupies, which will require forcing the element away from that space. The activities involved include movement and close combat, which is a form of close-range direct fire. It combines movement with fire combat, in summary. In order to conduct close assault, an enemy must expend half its movement allowance and then must have sufficient movement capability to move into the same areas as defending enemy element. The half move cost for close assault represents the fire combat. The actual close combat is occurring in the same area as the defending element, although for play purposes the element remains in base-to-base combat until a result is achieved as part of the close combat. The element conducting the close assault is called the close assault element. In addition to the close support element, a second element can provide fire support. An element which provides fire support, in this case, is called the close support element. The close support element also expends a half move and must have sufficient movement left to be able to move into the area the defending element occupies. Thus, the close support element supports the close assault element during the close combat. The close support element can be placed behind the close assault element. Remember, the close assault element is actually conducting close combat in the same area as the defending element. As long as the close support element has sufficient movement to move into the same space as the defending element, this is allowed. The defender can always conduct opportunity fire against the close assault element and the close support element, irrespective of any opportunity fire which may have occurred earlier. Once the elements have completed their close assault movement, the close combat occurs. The player first determines their close combat modifier and then spins a 10-sided dice on the close combat table, applying that modifier. There is a result for both the attacking element and defending element, which can be a disrupt, a rout, or can involve losses or no effect, which means it has won the close combat. It is possible for both elements to be disrupted. For the attacker, the result only applies to the close assault element. The close support element is unaffected. The Americans are close assaulting a Russian armoured infantry in a town, using a M1 as a close assault element and a second M1 as a close support element. After opportunity fire, the close combat modifier is calculated. The American close assault effectiveness is 8. Subtracted from this is the Russian close assault effectiveness of 6, resulting in +2. The Americans are attacking with 18 strength points against the Russian 6 strength points, thus they achieve an odds of 3-1, resulting in a +2 modifier. The Americans are attacking into a town, which results in a -2 modifier. The final modifier is +2. The Americans spin a 6 on a 10-sided dice, and after adding the +3 modifier, the result is 1. This means the defender loses 1 strength point and is disrupted, or routs, 6 centimetres. The American close assault element now occupies the area the defender previously occupied, and the close support element remains where it is. If the close support element was behind the close assault element, it could move up to remain in base-to-base contact with the close assault element. If the Americans had any other elements which had not yet moved, they could now move through the hole in the defender's defensive line. If they were able to close assault the disrupted enemy and disrupt it a second time, it would be eliminated. However, this is a very rare thing to occur. After the close combat, the defender retreats 6 centimetres. The close assault element advances to occupy the area vacated by the defender. the close support element remains in base-to-base contact with the close assault element. If the attacker had lost the close combat, it would remain in place and disrupted. This ends part 5 of my Corps Commander training series. Denken Sie daran, immer für Ihr Heimatland zu kämpfen.